Marvel Mystery Oil, the original mechanic in a can. It's like one of the hokiest things you'll ever come across. It's been around forever. They actually started making this stuff back in 1923, so it's been on the market for 100 years. And before I go any further, this is not a commercial for Marvel Mystery Oil. Nobody's paying me for this. Nobody gave me this. I'm doing this because it's an interesting product and it's something that I've used on occasion, and actually there is some validity to some of its uses. We did that video a few weeks ago about the head gasket in a can and how the sodium silicate can work in some circumstances and doesn't work in others. This is actually a lot broader than that, and it has a unique history, and it actually does work in certain circumstances. I do occasionally use this stuff. So, and it's unique. It's definitely unique. It's the only additive I could think of that you throw in the fuel system and in the oil on an internal combustion engine. It's like usually they're formulated for one or the other. Marvel mystery, it's a mystery. It does both. It didn't start out that way though. So before I give you the history on this, because that has a lot to do with its function, what it actually is, what it's good for, you have to understand what's in it. So for most of the 100 years that it's been on the market, it was a secret. It was a mystery, right? What's in this stuff? And then several years ago, there was a plane crash. So during the investigation of the plane crash, somebody blamed it on the mechanic using this stuff in the fuel system. So they investigated, the government investigated, and they broke this stuff down. And it breaks down into many smaller chemicals, but the bigger groups of it are, it's approximately a third of mineral oil, just mineral oil. The same as transmission fluid, same as hydraulic fluid, mineral oil. And that has certain good lubricating qualities. It's more than a third of Stoddard oil solvent. Okay, so Stoddard oil, think of it this way. It's very similar to turpentine. It's like a thick, oily turpentine. It's a solvent, and it works. It's always worked. It always will work. And then, according to the people who investigated, the government agency that investigated this, it also contains lard. Now, I don't know why there would be lard in here, but it's evidently got some lard in it. But the two main ingredients are the hydraulic oil, mineral oil, and the Stoddard solvent. So this was originally formulated by a carburetor company. This is going back in 1923. And you have to understand something about gasoline and how gasoline has changed over the years and what the original purpose of this was. So if you go back to 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s. Gasoline was formulated differently than it is today, because back then evaporation was a problem. Fuel systems were open to the atmosphere, and so evaporation, if you left gasoline just sit there for a short period of time, it would just evaporate. So they formulated gasoline with certain additives that prevented it from evaporating. And so what it would do is it would reduce. And when it reduces, it becomes a varnish. It becomes like a gummy varnish. And you old timers are all familiar with that, right? So cars would be on the road for just a couple of years with new carburetors, and they would start to get gummed up. And this was a very common thing, especially in the early days. Because not only was the gasoline blended differently, but it was blended way differently depending on which refinery was doing it, which part of the country it was going to. So it was an issue. After a few years, you'd start to have carburetor problems. Now also, that same additive, those same additives that they use there for anti-evaporation properties, would gather on the backs of valves and in the combustion chamber and along the ringlands, and it would gum the rings and it would gum the valves. So this was a way to get around all of that. By using the Stoddard oil that's in here, it would break down that gum and just allow it to be flowed through the motor and burned. Now there were other things too. The Stoddard oil will attach to water the same way that like dry gas does. So when you've got water in the tank, the Stoddard oil will grab onto that and it'll allow it to be burned. So there's a lot of reasons. That's how this stuff was originally intended to be used. But then they started throwing it in the oil too. And I don't know at what point it started becoming an oil additive. It might have been from the very beginning. But the same basic principle was there. If you've got gum and varnish on the top end of the engine, well, you can have gum and varnish on the bottom end of the engine. And early oil was like that. Early oil gathered on everything. It became like a jelly after a while. So a solvent in the oiling system would help. Now, those situations don't exist with modern cars anymore, because we have gasoline that is, if you just leave it sit for 2 days, 3 days in the open, it's completely gone. It evaporates completely. And on our oil, we have detergent oils, and the engines burn much cleaner than they used to. But there are still some uses for this to this day. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to go through the different parts that it would affect and how it would affect them, where it will work or where it won't work. Because you talk to the old timers and this stuff fixes everything. You got a rod knock, Marvel mystery oil. No compression, Marvel mystery oil. You got the rickets, Marvel mystery oil. Marvel mystery oil fixes everything. I want to go through the parts inside of an engine and talk about what it can fix and what it can't fix today. So I guess this was originally designed to be used as a carburetor cleaner. And again, today we don't really have that problem. First, because the vast majority of everything is fuel injected. Only us Luddites still play around with carbureted engines. So we don't have that gum problem anymore. But we do have the ethanol that's blended into our gasoline reduced to water. And the Stoddard oil or the Stoddard solvent attaches to that. So this can keep the water that gathers in your fuel system from becoming a problem. It'll bond to it just like dry gas does. So yes, even in today's application with carburetors, it'll still work. But something that they never ever thought of back in the day, because it didn't exist when they invented this stuff, is the fuel injector. So one of the things about the fuel injector is that even though it's pressurized, the tip of the fuel injector is still exposed to the intake port. Now, one of the things you have happening in the intake port of any engine is reversion. When the intake valve opens, there is some backfeed into the port, and that's why you get carbon and you get buildup inside the intake ports and on the intake valves of modern fuel injected engines. Well, the injector itself starts to become a little clogged, a little sloppy, let's say, from some of those deposits that built up on the end of the injector. Marvel mystery oil will knock that stuff off. And just like on the earlier engines where it was cleaning the gum and the varnish from the stem of the intake valve, the back face of the intake valve, well, it's doing the same thing with the carbon that builds up there today. So now you take carbon away from the back of an intake valve, you make the intake valve hotter to the fuel that's coming in and touching it. And that's part of the vaporization process that makes an engine run smooth and efficient. So even though this stuff was never intended to be used on fuel-injected engines, because fuel-injected engines didn't exist when it was made, it has a very good use on fuel-injected engines. So it'll clean your injector, it'll clean the back of the intake manifold, the intake valve, it'll clean the port, it'll clean most of that stuff off. The solvent goes to work on that. But now the mineral oil will also help keep the valve seals soft, because over time heat gets to the valve seals and they get brittle and they don't seal anymore. Well, the mineral oil that's in there will actually help keep the rubber soft. And that's why they tell you to throw this stuff in transmissions also, because even though transmission fluid is based on mineral oil, this stuff, the mineral oil they use in here, is slightly different and is a good lubricant for rubber. Okay. Now you get to the meaty stuff, right? So this improves compression, according to the label. Now, how can this stuff improve compression? All right, from the top end and from the bottom end. So as a gasoline additive, a top cylinder lubricant, it actually can unstick rings. Darn. It actually can unstick rings. So this is a 200,000 mile old Jeep engine, and you could see how much sludge there is on here. Now, this oil ring is basically stuck in place. See, I can move it, right, but it doesn't really want to move. So this oil ring is not going to be really efficient. It's loaded with gunk. Now, from the top side, the Marvel Mystery Oil will help break up whatever carbon deposits are on the ring or in the ring land and allow the ring full, easy movement. And so it can improve compression, not drastically. Like if you've got a bad ring or you've got a gouged cylinder, no amount of Marvel Mystery Oil in the world is going to help it. But if you've got slightly binding rings, top rings, yeah, it'll break them loose. Now from the bottom end, you've got the oil being splashed up against the oil ring. Well, you've got this situation where this ring is just, it's gummy, right? It just doesn't want to move. Well, the Marvel Mystery Oil as a solvent, a starter solvent, will get up in there and break it free. So it can help. I'm not saying it's going to help, but it absolutely can help in maintaining compression and reducing oil burning. It's simple stuff. The chemical and the thing that it has to do. Look how dirty I got from that. See, if it was all Marvel Mystery Oil, you wouldn't have that. But it can work in that instance. Now, one of the problems you have with modern engines, like for instance, you've got this LS rocker, and these LS engines, or any engine with needle bearings, with fine needle bearings like in the rockers, over time you'll get a varnish or a gum built up inside there, and it'll prevent full lubrication of those little needle bearings, the trunnion part of this. So the Marvel Mystery Oil in the oil can keep those rollers clean and allow fresh oil to get at it constantly. So yes, even on a modern engine like an LS, it does serve a purpose. It can serve a purpose on the oil side of things. Now they make a big deal about it quieting down lifter noise. That's dubious at best, because if you've got actual wear, so if you've got cam lobe wear, if the lifter is worn on the bottom, if the push rod is bent, if the rocker is worn, if any of those circumstances happen, you'd actually have to take the bottle of this stuff and wedge it between the sloppy parts to make the lifter noise go away. But if you've got the tiny hole, the tiny feed hole in the lifter blocked or partially blocked, this stuff will break down what's blocking it, the gunk that's blocking it, and allow oil to flow. So yes, it is possible for Marvel Mystery Oil to free up a stuck lifter. It's not likely. It's probably very unlikely, but it can work. It will do it. You could also, you had situations in the old days where an engine would sit for a while, the lifter would bleed down, and then the inside of the plunger would start to gum up. So the lifter wouldn't want to pump completely up, and you get a lifter noise that way. You don't really have that anymore. But that's besides the point. It can work. Now, today's oils have a lot of various detergents and chemicals in them that do the same stuff that this does. So I'm not, here's the thing. Even if you're using a good detergent oil, it may not work exactly the same as the started oil that's in this stuff. So you may want to give it a shot. But again, it's unlikely that it's really going to help you with a lifter noise problem. Now, here's another thing, timing chains. And this is something that they don't talk about. But this stuff could actually prolong the life of your timing chain. Because again, as these things go through 50, 100,000 miles of use, they'll start to get dirty. And when they get dirty, the oil doesn't want to flow into the rollers the way it should, and they'll wear quicker. So you'll get more stretch on the chain overall. So the Marvel Mystery Oil in the oil will keep the chain cleaner and allow oil to get in there and lubricate it. Oil pressure. So now, if your bearings are toast, if your crank is worn, the bearings are worn, any of that stuff, well, there's just no way this could ever help with oil pressure. But a fairly common problem with older engines, and especially much older engines, is the oil pump bypass, which is what regulates the oil pressure. So in here is a valve. Inside of every oil pump is a valve, and the valve is spring-loaded to open at a certain pressure to allow maximum oil pressure. So in other words, like at 40 pounds, 60 pounds, whatever yours happens to be set at, the bypass will open up, and it will not allow the pump to generate any higher pressure than that. That's the purpose of it. So it's a very fine fit cylinder in there. Over time, it'll get dirty and may not seat completely. If it doesn't seat completely, where you would normally get, let's say, 30 pounds of oil pressure at idle, you'll only get 3 pounds of oil pressure at idle or 4 pounds of oil pressure at idle. The telltale with that is that as soon as you touch the gas, the gauge just leaps up. But that accumulation of gunk inside the bypass could stick the valve, keep it from completely closing, and give you an oil pressure issue. The starter oil that's in here could break that up and bring back oil pressure. And I'm not even reaching with this stuff. These are actually very common situations to like all internal combustion engines. And this stuff, as hokey as it is, and man, it's hokey. I don't think Rob from Illinois thinks it's hokey. It's the best dollars he ever spent. But it's ancient. And as silly as it may seem, it actually does work in certain circumstances. Now, I could keep going on and on because there's so many little bits through an engine's fuel system and an oiling system to say how this would affect it or wouldn't affect it, but then this video would go on for hours and hours. I think you get the general point. It's not something to completely write off. It's not something to just laugh at when the old-timer says, throw some Marvel Mystery Oil in there. Don't laugh it off completely. It may actually have a chance of doing the things, some of the things, most of the things that it claims to on the bottle. And it probably won't make your plane crash either. I have no idea what the Lord does, but that's interesting, right? I'll see you tomorrow.